Hello, welcome to Illinois Law, sponsored by the Illinois State Bar Association. I'm Sam Kavathis and I'll be your host for tonight's show. Our topic tonight is understanding the juvenile justice system, and I have three fine guests to help us with tonight's topic. My first guest is Mark Hasikis. He is a civil personal injury attorney. He graduated from St. Louis University Law School in 1976 and has had his own private practice for the years where he is the prominent partner in the firm. In addition, Mark has been involved with many bar associations throughout the state, and specifically this past year he was the president of the Illinois State Bar Association, and he did a lot of great things for the Illinois State Bar Association last year. Also, during his tenure as a president of the Illinois State Bar Association, Mark was very involved with the juvenile justice matters. Mark, welcome to tonight's show.
Thank you very much, Sam.
My second guest is Katrin Valencia. Katrin started her tenure at the Cook County Juvenile Probation in 1999 and was initially a field probation officer in the Lawndale community of Chicago. She then went to law school and earned her Juris Doctorate from Chicago College of Law in 2003. Following that, in October of 2004, Katrin became the Deputy Chief for the Circuit Court of Cook County Juvenile Probation Department, where she is currently positioned. In addition, Katrin also remains active with the Girls Link, where she is co-chair to stay involved with female responsive issues. Katrin, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
And my third guest is the Honorable James Radcliffe. He began his career in 1977 as an assistant public defender in St. Clair County. He then went into private practice in a firm in Belleville, Illinois. After 10 years in private practice, he became an associate judge in the 20th Judicial Circuit, and then in 1996 he became the presiding judge of the juvenile court in that area. He is also currently a mediator and arbitrator in the Associate Dispute Resolution. He also is the associate director of the Lawyers Assistant Program and also a technical advisor in the Adult Redeploy in Illinois. Thanks very much, James, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Sam.
I'd like to first start out by at least telling our audience, when we talk about the juvenile justice system, there's a couple sides to it, and tonight we're going to deal with one side. And what is that we're going to do tonight? Delinquency?
Well, we're going to deal with delinquency. There's two sides of the juvenile court. There's the child protective side, where the court's involved with youth that are abused or neglected. The other side is the delinquency side, and that's the side that we're going to be talking about
tonight. And when
tonight.
we talk about the delinquency side, what are we basically talking about?
Well, we're talking about kids that have been charged with crimes.
Okay. And what age group do we start with when we talk about a juvenile? What does the system look at a juvenile at what age?
Well, right now our court, anyone under the age of 17 who's charged with a crime falls under the Juvenile Court Act for a felony. Anyone under the age of 18 who's charged with a misdemeanor falls under the Juvenile Court Act.
And who makes this decision whether or not to prosecute a child or a minor in a court system? How does that come about? How does the system work?
It's very discretionary, Sam, with the state's attorneys involved throughout the state, really. And there can be different standards somewhat applied, depends on the state's attorney and how much intel and information the state's attorney may receive, and then what decision he or she makes in that role.
And when we talk about a decision, what type of offenses are we looking at for somebody who gets involved in the juvenile system? Where does it start? What type of classifications? I know we talked earlier before the show started about nonviolent and violent. What are the classifications as to when somebody might become prosecuted in a juvenile system?
Well, the Juvenile Court Act follows the adult system in terms of the categories of crime. So you have the same categories of crime in juvenile court. As I said, the age is up to 17 for felonies in juvenile court and up to 18 in misdemeanors. There's also a provision in the statute where under certain circumstances a youth can be transferred into the adult court and bypass the juvenile court.
And before they get into the courts, are there other places where they might go, or what happens before they actually get into the court system for prosecution of them? And is there something that happens before they make the decision, like maybe they're not going to prosecute somebody, they do something else for it?
Well, we have, once a kid gets arrested, then they would come in before the screeners, like they said, with the state's attorney. Then they decide sometimes we can divert cases. So, like juvenile probation can get involved before they actually file a petition. So we do offer some preventative measures also with diversion cases.
And if they do that diversion cases, how do they stay out of the system? I mean, before they do that, what happens with them?
It's basically like an informal supervision. So it can go up to 90 days. We can offer referrals for community organizations so that the kids can get help. Probation officers can interview the families to see what their needs are. Are they going to school? Do they need substance abuse treatment? Those kind of things. And if they comply with those conditions, then the state's attorney will not prosecute the cases.
Okay, and let's say that doesn't work, and now let's talk about what happens when the youth gets into the system. Where does it go once they get into the system?
Well, if a case is going to be prosecuted by the local state's attorney's office, a petition for delinquency is filed, and that sets out the allegations of the crime. And then the youth is processed through the juvenile court, except for the transfer cases that I mentioned earlier. And then the case is adjudicated in the juvenile court. If there's an adjudication, a finding made, then it goes on to a disposition, and there's a whole variety of dispositions that the court has available.
And let's talk about, we were talking about the different facilities. Once an adjudication is made of the youth versus like a violent or nonviolent crime, where do they eventually go? Where do these children go once they're adjudicated?
We
Is
try
that the
to
term
keep
finding guilt, or what was that the
Adjudicated
term?
delinquent.
Adjudicated delinquent.
And that's the final determination of what happens to them?
Correct.
Well, that sets, once there's an adjudication made, then there's a further hearing called a dispositional hearing, where the court makes a determination of what appropriate disposition is in place for that kid. And it can range anything from a supervision, which is kind of an informal probation, through a probation to incarceration at a centralized lockup.
And when we use the word court, that is just a judge. It's not a jury trial. It's a court, a judge, female or male, making a determination.
And is the courts an actual courts, like in the circuit courts, whatever it is, all the different circuit courts have an actual courtroom where the hearings, where the judges, here's the evidence? I mean, was there an actual hearing for these things? Are there defenses for the people? Who represents these people?
Well, in most cases, most counties have public defender offices, and for those youth and families that don't have the means to retain counsel, generally the public defender is appointed. They can also have private counsel, so there's always representation for a youth that's charged with a crime.
Okay, and once we said they make the determination, how long do they stay in the system, and where do they go? I know, Mark, you tell me you've been around the state during your tenure as the bar president.
Right.
Where are these facilities located, and what are the facilities?
Well, there's different detention facilities that aren't necessarily as permanent. They can be very temporary, even before an adjudication. And there are a number of those in Cook County. There's one larger facility I'm aware of in Cook County where there's more permanent accommodations. And then throughout the state, there are about 8 other facilities, primary facilities. And usually we're talking about 13-year-olds to 18-year-olds typically. And the average stay, I think, is in about a 6-month, 8-month time period, roughly.
Now, you said before they're adjudicated, there's also a detention center where they keep them, meaning that if somebody commits a crime, a youth commits a crime, and is that the term? If a youth is
Well, they've had a confrontation with the law, let's say that.
Okay, all right. And before the actual court hearing is done, and the court determines that maybe it's not safe for them to be out on the street for whatever it might be, where are they held?
Normally they're held in the detention centers, and so they would be held there awaiting trial, or if it's post-adjudication, they would be awaiting a hearing maybe on a violation, a technical violation. If they picked up a new offense, they could be temporarily housed in the detention
And
center.
when we talk about detention center, you know, people who haven't been involved in this or people who are watching kids or kids who are watching, what is a detention center? I mean, is it just a facility, a home? Is it a cell? Is it an actual prison? What are they like?
It's a lockdown facility.
It's like a prison.
It's a
For youth.
prison. There's cells. There's locked
Guards,
doors.
things
There's
like that?
guards. It's a secured facility.
And who makes that determination whether somebody stays in that facility during the time that the case is pending?
Whatever judge is sitting in juvenile court makes that determination at a detention hearing. There's actually a hearing put on where the court makes a determination, basically looking at whether or not it's necessary to detain this youth for the protection of the community and to ensure that the youth participates in the proceedings of the court. Detention is obviously the most severe pre-adjudication disposition that you can make. There's other alternatives. You can put a youth on electronic monitoring, and you try to find the least restrictive manner in which to have the youth before the adjudication, to make sure they show up for trial and to make sure as much as possible that the community is secured.
And Sam, we've talked about that word diversion. That's the whole idea, is to really do all that we can do to prevent especially moderate, low offending youth from having to be detained permanently. And that's a big focus, frankly. There's even a House bill, Senate bill that was just passed. I think it's still waiting for the governor's signature. Hopefully by the time this show will air that it's been signed. It reinforces that just what Jim said, that the very, very last resort should be incarceration. And so that all the other steps are taken first, whether a youth has had one problem or two problems or three problems. We find that so many of the youth are back in a facility because of a parole violation. Lots of times, the great majority, I think, are of that category. So you've got someone who may have had a problem at school or at home or disturbance, and it may not be a very serious thing, but it's still enough to cause that probation to be violated, and then back into detention.
We're going to take a short break first, and then we'll come back with your comments. This is Illinois Law, sponsored by the Illinois State Bar Association, and tonight's topic is understanding the juvenile justice system, and we'll be back in just 1 minute.
You're ready. You're on now.
Bye, Tyler.
Bye-bye, Tyler.
Dear, it's time for serious talk
Oh?
about my daycare. When I started out, it was just to help the neighbors. But lately, it's getting to be a real handful. I need some help.
What can I do?
I need advice on more space, a loan,
What about incorporating?
and insurance.
Wait, I know who we can call.
Times like this require sound advice. Your lawyer can help. A message from the Illinois State Bar Association.
It's your fault! Never! Mister!
Over and over,
Come on! It's our Leave me alone! Shut up! Out!
time and again,
No! Drive me nuts! Shut up! You're the dumbest
generation after generation.
I hate you! I hate you too!
Isn't it time we stop the cycle? Now,
I hate you! I hate you!
stop adult violence. Teach kids peace. A message from the Illinois State Bar Association.
Hello, welcome back to Illinois Law, sponsored by the Illinois State Bar Association. I'm Sam Kavathis, your host tonight, and we're talking about understanding the juvenile justice system with my guests Mark Haskis, Keatron Valencia, and James Radcliffe. Keatron, we were just getting into talking to you. Were going to mention something about the the system itself, and what were you going to tell us about it?
Well, one thing that we try to do is before we file violations, we really do administrative sanctions. So our goal is to provide services for the kids in the community and try to get them enrolled in school, try to meet their needs before we file a technical violation. So it's our goal to keep them out of detention and find alternatives instead of just quickly filing a violation. Our goal is to keep them out of detention.
A couple things I wanted to maybe clear up or understand a little bit. You know, you always hear, you know, we're going to charge this kid as an adult, or, you know, instead of a juvenile. How do they make that decision as to whether or not to charge him as adult or a juvenile in the court systems?
Well, there's basically three what we call transfer provisions in the statute. There's certain, the legislature has determined that certain youth of a certain age, if they commit a certain category of crimes, they're automatically transferred into the adult court. They're not even seen by the juvenile court judge.
And that's why they say they're tried as an adult, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. There's also a presumptive transfer where, again, at certain ages and given the crime charge, there's a presumption that they go into adult court, but that can be rebutted by the youth and their attorney.
And who makes that decision then? Does that
the
come
judge
before
does.
the judge? And
The
he hears
juvenile
that?
court judge
And he
does.
makes a decision.
Right.
All
And
right.
then there's also discretionary transfers where it's totally up to the judge whether or not to keep the case in juvenile court or transfer it to the adult system.
Okay. Now, once, as we talked about, once the youth is a determined juvenile, or there's a determination made, let's talk about the process after that. They can be incarcerated, right? They can be on probation, or they can be on detention. Are those basically the alternatives that they can be?
There's also supervision,
Okay.
which is a kind of an informal probation.
Okay, let's go by the steps then. Supervision, you said, is the most informal one, where they have a certain period of time. If they don't commit another crime, then they're okay?
Right.
Is it off their record,
Right.
or are those things stay with the youth? What happens with that?
Well, the arrest stays with them unless it's expunged.
Okay, and you know, you hear in adult courts or whatever, there's always this right to expungement. Does a youth have the right to expunge a criminal, as an adjudication, we said, right? An adjudication?
He or she can apply at some point. The problem becomes money, know-how, knowledge. In fact, so many arrests, even without a conviction, sometimes are still on a youth record, and that can be a very big impediment to advancing into the military or with jobs and school. So that's another issue, that those, again, that burden's placed on that youth or his family.
If a
or
youth
family.
becomes, you know, let's say they're an adult and 3-4 years later, do they have to go back to the juvenile court to get it expunged, or do they
Yes.
go into the regular court system?
The juvenile.
Court.
And a lot of misconception occurs with juvenile cases, that kids think that, oh, it's a juvenile case, it's automatically going to expunge, but there's actually a process that they have to go through. And not only with a conviction, but also with the arrest, because that does show up on their record. So it's very important that they need to go through those steps, go to the clerk's office, get the forms, file those forms to go through the process to get it expunged. And there's a hearing.
And just recently in Cook County, I think we had a huge turnout by the county clerk to educate the public about that. It was huge numbers.
They have
I mean,
fairs.
into the thousands that came and showed up to work on the expungement, because they've realized the impediment to their record, and these youth are growing up and they're more serious now.
Right.
They've matured and they're ready to become, good citizens.
Is there a right to an appeal, and does it go to the appellate court when you have a determination by a judge or adjudication of a minor?
Well, that's really, I can address that. It turns out that in the past year, I think the numbers were in about the 50 range only of appeals, and the reason is that as the youth grow and they get older, it takes too long to get through the system, Sam. So it's not always a viable option to appeal. There is another hope that we can get something changed with respect to the court, Supreme Court maybe, to get a rule that might give some expediency to these matters, much like with a serious health injury, illness that needs immediate attention on a court matter. Same thing's true of these youth, that really their lives are in balance at a young age, and they need to have that expediency in the ruling.
Now, we talked about the supervision. Then the next stage we said is like a home monitor program. Who monitors them in the home monitor program?
The Juvenile Probation Department. And there's two different, it's kind of graduated. So there's a home confinement where the judge can order them to be, to stay in their home for certain hours, kind of like a curfew. and we have officers that go out and check to make sure that they're home. We also have electronic monitoring. So if it's a little bit more serious violation or more serious offense, then they can put the minor on electronic monitoring where they have the bracelet. In Cook County just acquired through a lot of grant funding, GPS monitoring. So we're able to monitor exactly where the kids are at. If they're going to school, we can monitor if they're in compliance with that court order, and if there's a protective order where they're not supposed to go near a victim, we can monitor exactly where the minor is at.
And then do we say there's probation and then incarceration? Is that the next phase there is? Is probation different than like a home monitoring, or?
Well, electronic monitoring can be either pre-adjudication or post-adjudication. So before, when a kid is on trial, pending trial, they can also be placed on these as an alternative to detaining them. Because again, our goal is to keep them in the least restrictive environment. So if the judge feels that this kid can be successful and not be detained and is not a safety hazard, then they can put them on electronic monitoring. So not all kids get incarcerated. Not all kids, it's not like a path that once you get on probation, you're going to get incarcerated. Again, our goal is to keep them out and have alternatives. So,
And again, the great majority of these youth are low and moderate offending youth, Sam, where incarceration, and by the studies, is proven that does more harm than good with incarceration. So we want to have that youth in the regular, normal work day or school day or what have you for that youth.
And sentencing for when they, for the most serious ones, where there's actual incarceration, is there a sentencing like you're in for a year or 2 years or 3 years? What happens with the determination as to how long somebody goes to or is incarcerated?
Well, Sam, in juvenile court, unlike adult court, the judge does not sentence a youth to a specific term. The youth is sentenced to an indeterminate term in the Department of Juvenile Justice. It used to be the Juvenile Division of the Department of Corrections. And then it's up to the DJJ to determine when that youth would be released.
And how is that, when they make the determination as to when they're released, once they are released, who watches over them? Does your department do that then, follow them?
It depends. The juvenile judge can sentence the minor to the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice with what's called a bring-back order, or you call it a callback order, is that what?
Yeah.
And they can bring the minor back and place them back on probation if they get a good report while they're in the Department of Juvenile Justice. If they go straight from the Department of Juvenile Justice and get released from there, they're placed on parole.
And what does that mean? What happens with the parole period?
That's functioned by the state.
Right. Their follow-up, and we need to talk. There's a little bit of difference between Cook County sometimes and the rest of the state, so that's why we're looking at each other sometimes about some of the time sequences. But the other thing that's important is that there's a really need for this aftercare when a youth then is released. There's not been a lot of that, frankly. Just recently in Cook County, really parole officers or probation officers, aftercare type people, much like a social worker, looks after that youth to make sure he or she can filter back into the system and the communities the proper way and mentor, and in fact get involved even before the release of the youth to know the parents, know more about that youth. And that downstate hasn't been funded yet, which is another big issue. So we just release these youth and say have a good life, good luck. And that's not really a practical way to do this.
And what happens if they violate those probations or parole, or they've gone out and they recommit another offense? What happens to them the second time around?
It depends on the offense and what happens with that. Again, it could be a very modest parole violation. It could be something more serious. It will depend. Now, you asked a question earlier, and it's important to address really about some of these offenses and what really happens with them. I know in most of the state that superintendent of the facility where a youth may be detained, they're always hopefully doing the job to look and see about the progress the youth is making, what type of mental health issue needs to be treated, if any, what type of educational services need to be provided, really seeing how the youth is adapting. And they'll make decisions about whether to shift a youth out of a cell, even in the same unit, what is working, what's not working, or move them out of the whole facility to another facility. It just depends. Those decisions are made at the top.
So once they're done with the court system itself, then the facilities and the system itself deals with the youth and where they go, from maybe detention to then home monitoring or probation? Can they make that decision, the facilities, as to downgrading them to where they go, or do they have to come back to the court system?
Generally, if a youth is sent to DJJ, they
And what's
determine
DJJ is?
Department of Juvenile Justice.
Okay.
It's the old juvenile division of the
Okay.
Department of Corrections.
All right.
They make the determination when the youth would be released from the facility. But then it's on a juvenile parole, and I believe in Cook County they've developed just recently some transitional type of services, because it's extremely important whenever you take a youth from the community, send them to a central lockup, and they spend time there and go through whatever resources are available, you have to reintegrate that youth back into the local community, and that's a very difficult process.
And that process we can talk about, on another show, about ways to alternatives to avoid the kids going back in there and other things that we can do. We have just 1 minute left in this show for understanding the justice system. Is there any one last remark each one of you would like to say to the audience about the system itself and what can be done to maybe make the system better in the last 10, 15 seconds?
Sam, I'll say
each?
this. A lot of folks, when they hear the word juvenile justice, it's kind of an old term and it's not real exciting. But, and they think, well, how can it affect me? It's not my child in trouble. It's not my neighbor's child in trouble. I don't know anybody on our block that's in trouble. But you know what? It all affects all of us. And so these youth, when they are sent away, guess what? They get older and they only come back to the only area they know, which was their community from which they came. So it's important that we really try to have as many productive citizens as we can.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much for watching tonight's show, sponsored by the Illinois State Bar Association, Understanding Juvenile Justice. And I'd like to thank my guests, Mark Hasikis, Katrin Valencia, and James Radcliffe. Thanks for being with us tonight's show.
Thank you.
And good night.